The F-22 Raptor screamed through the dawn sky at Mach 1.8, its pilot executing a barrel roll that would have been impossible for any other aircraft in the world. But this wasn't just any pilot at the controls. This was Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell, and in the next 47 minutes, she would prove that everything the United States Air Force thought it knew about women in combat was catastrophically wrong. 5 enemy MiG-29s had crossed into American airspace, their intent clear: probe defenses, test response times, and send a message that hostile forces could strike whenever they chose. The seasoned male pilots who were supposed to handle this threat were grounded due to a training accident the day before. The only pilot available with the clearance and aircraft certification to respond was the woman they'd spent 3 years trying to keep out of combat operations. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The California desert stretched endlessly beyond the windows of Classroom Delta 7 at Edwards Air Force Base, its stark beauty serving as a constant reminder of the unforgiving environment where America's elite pilots learned to master the world's most advanced fighter aircraft. Captain Sarah Mitchell sat in the front row, her flight suit immaculate despite the pre-dawn start time, her notebook filled with precise diagrams and calculations that demonstrated a mastery of aerodynamics that impressed even her instructors. At 26, Sarah possessed the kind of flying instincts that couldn't be taught and the analytical mind that separated good pilots from legendary ones. Her father, Colonel James Mitchell, had been a Vietnam-era F-4 Phantom pilot whose stories of aerial combat had shaped Sarah's childhood dreams. Her mother, Dr. Elizabeth Mitchell, was an aerospace engineer who had worked on the F-22's flight control systems. Sarah had inherited her father's natural flying ability and her mother's technical brilliance, creating a combination that should have made her the ideal candidate for the Air Force's most prestigious combat program. The Advanced Fighter Tactics School at Edwards was where the military's best pilots learned to fly the F-22 Raptor, the world's most sophisticated air superiority fighter. Only 12 pilots were selected each year from hundreds of applicants, and graduation meant assignment to the elite squadrons that protected American airspace from any threat that dared to challenge it. Sarah had dreamed of this moment since she was 8 years old, watching her father's old squadron perform at air shows, promising herself that someday she would fly the fastest, deadliest aircraft in the world. Her qualifications were impeccable. She had graduated first in her class from the Air Force Academy, completed undergraduate pilot training with distinction, and accumulated over 800 hours of flight time in F-16 Fighting Falcons. Her gunnery scores were in the 98th percentile, her tactical knowledge was encyclopedic, and her ability to think 3 steps ahead during complex aerial scenarios had earned the respect of every instructor she'd worked with. More importantly, she possessed the kind of spatial awareness and split-second decision-making ability that separated competent pilots from those who survived when enemies were trying to kill them. But, as Sarah sat in that classroom listening to Colonel Marcus Reynolds deliver his opening address to the new class, she began to understand that her qualifications might not be enough. Reynolds was a legend in fighter pilot circles, a man who had shot down 3 enemy aircraft during the Gulf War and had spent the last decade shaping the Air Force's approach to air-to-air combat. His reputation was built on results, but his worldview had been formed in an era when women were prohibited from combat roles, and he made no effort to hide his skepticism about the recent policy changes that had opened fighter squadrons to female pilots. Ladies and gentlemen, Reynolds began, his gray eyes sweeping across the classroom with the confidence of someone who had never doubted his place in the world. You are here because someone believes you have the potential to fly the most advanced air superiority fighter ever built. But potential and reality are very different things. The F-22 isn't just an aircraft. It's a weapon system that requires a pilot who can make life-and-death decisions in milliseconds while pulling 9 gigaseconds and traveling at twice the speed of sound. Sarah listened intently, her pen ready to capture every detail that might give her an edge in the training ahead. She had studied Reynolds' combat record, analyzed his tactics, and memorized every interview he had given about air-to-air combat. She understood that earning his respect would be crucial to her success in the program, and she was prepared to work harder than anyone else to prove she belonged in that classroom. Combat flying isn't like the training scenarios you've experienced, Reynolds continued, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had watched friends die when split-second hesitation meant the difference between victory and death. When you're facing an enemy pilot who has trained his entire life to kill you, When missiles are tracking toward your aircraft at 3 times the speed of sound, when you have less than 2 seconds to decide whether to engage or evade, there's no room for uncertainty, no time for second-guessing, and no margin for error. The words were directed at the entire class, but Sarah noticed that Reynolds' gaze lingered on her longer than on the other students. It wasn't the look of an instructor assessing a promising student. It was the expression of someone who had already made up his mind about her capabilities and found them wanting. The realization sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the air conditioning system. Major Lisa Thompson, the deputy commander of the training program, took over the briefing with a detailed overview of the curriculum that lay ahead. 6 months of intensive training that would push every student to their physical and mental limits. Academic coursework covering advanced aerodynamics, threat analysis, and weapons employment. Simulator training that would recreate every possible combat scenario, from dogfighting to beyond visual range missile engagements. And finally, live-fire exercises that would determine which students had the skills and temperament necessary to fly combat missions in the world's most expensive fighter aircraft. The F-22 represents the pinnacle of American military technology, Thompson explained, her presentation filled with technical specifications that made Sarah's pulse quicken with anticipation. Twin Pratt & Whitney engines producing 35,000 pounds of thrust each. Stealth capabilities that make it virtually invisible to enemy radar. Avionics systems that can track multiple targets simultaneously while maintaining situational awareness in the most complex threat environments. But all of that technology is meaningless without a pilot who can integrate it into a cohesive fighting system. Sarah absorbed every detail, her mind already beginning to visualize how she would approach the training scenarios ahead. She had spent months studying F-22 tactics, memorizing the aircraft's capabilities, and analyzing combat footage from training exercises. She understood that the Raptor wasn't just a faster, more maneuverable version of the F-16s she had been flying. It was a fundamentally different approach to air combat that required pilots to think in 3 dimensions while managing information streams that would overwhelm most human beings. During the break between briefings, Sarah approached Colonel Reynolds with a question about thrust vectoring and its applications in beyond visual range combat. His response was polite but dismissive, the kind of answer he might give to a journalist rather than a fellow pilot. The interaction lasted less than 30 seconds, but it confirmed Sarah's growing suspicion that she would face obstacles in this program that had nothing to do with her flying ability. Captain Michael Torres, one of her classmates, struck up a conversation as they walked to the next briefing. Torres was a former F-15 pilot with an impressive record, and the kind of easy confidence that came from years of being told he was exactly what the Air Force was looking for. "So what's your background?" he asked, his tone friendly but carrying an undertone that suggested he was genuinely surprised to find a woman in the program. "F-16s out of Luke Air Force Base," Sarah replied. "Close air support and air-to-air training, 800 hours, mostly in simulated combat scenarios." She didn't mention that her gunnery scores were higher than 90% of the male pilots in her previous squadron, or that she had been personally recommended for the F-22 program by her commanding officer, who had called her the most naturally gifted pilot he had worked with in 20 years. "That's solid experience," Torres said, though his expression suggested he was still processing the idea of competing against a woman for one of the limited spots in the program. "Reynolds has a reputation for being pretty demanding. Word is he doesn't think much of the recent policy changes regarding women in combat roles." The comment was casual, almost offhand, but it carried implications that made Sarah's stomach tighten. She had known that entering a male-dominated field would present challenges, but she had assumed that performance would speak louder than prejudice, that excellence would overcome institutional resistance. The possibility that her gender might be seen as a disqualifying factor regardless of her capabilities was something she had tried not to think about during the months of preparation leading up to this moment. That evening, Sarah called her father from her quarters on base. Colonel Mitchell had retired 3 years earlier, but he maintained connections throughout the Air Force and had been following the gradual integration of women into combat roles, with the perspective of someone who had seen the military evolve over 3 decades of service. "How was the first day?" he asked, his voice carrying the warmth of a father who had watched his daughter pursue her dreams with a combination of pride and concern. "Challenging," Sarah replied carefully. "The technical aspects are exactly what I expected, but there are cultural factors that might be more difficult to navigate than I anticipated." Her father was quiet for a moment, understanding immediately what she meant. "Reynolds is old school," he said finally. "He's a good officer and an exceptional pilot, but he comes from an era when women weren't allowed in fighter cockpits. That doesn't make his views right, but it explains where they come from. How do I prove myself to someone who's already decided I don't belong?" Sarah asked, voicing the question that had been haunting her since the morning briefing. "The same way you always have," her father replied. "By being so undeniably good at what you do that even the skeptics have to acknowledge your capabilities. But Sarah, you need to understand that some people won't change their minds regardless of how well you perform. Your job isn't to convert them. It's to be ready when the opportunity comes to prove what you're capable of." As Sarah prepared for bed that night, she reviewed her notes from the day's briefings and began planning her approach to the challenges ahead. She understood that she would be held to a higher standard than her male classmates, that every mistake would be magnified and every success would be minimized. But she also understood that this was the price of being a pioneer, of opening doors that had previously been closed to women who shared her dreams. Outside her window, she could hear the sound of F-22s conducting night training exercises, their twin engines creating a distinctive roar that spoke of power and precision beyond anything she had experienced in her F-16. In a few weeks, she would be climbing into the cockpit of one of those aircraft, experiencing the kind of performance that represented the absolute pinnacle of human aviation achievement. The thought filled her with anticipation that overcame her concerns about Reynolds' attitude and the cultural barriers she would face. She had spent her entire life preparing for this opportunity, and she wasn't about to let prejudice or institutional resistance prevent her from achieving the dream that had shaped every decision she had made since childhood. But as she drifted off to sleep, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the real test wouldn't be mastering the F-22's complex systems or proving her tactical knowledge. The real test would be finding a way to succeed in an environment where some of the people evaluating her performance had already decided that women couldn't handle the pressures of air-to-air combat, regardless of evidence to the contrary. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The F-22 simulator bay hummed with the sound of cooling systems, working overtime to manage the heat generated by the most sophisticated flight training equipment in the world. Sarah strapped herself into the cockpit that would become her second home over the next 6 months, her hands moving instinctively across controls that represented millions of dollars in research and development. The simulator could recreate any flying condition imaginable, from routine training flights to the chaos of multi-aircraft dogfights, where split-second decisions determined who lived and who died. "Mitchell, you're first up for air-to-air scenarios," announced Captain Derek Sullivan, the lead simulator instructor whose reputation for breaking overconfident pilots was legendary throughout Edwards. Sullivan had flown F-15 Eagles in combat over Iraq and had a particular talent for designing scenarios that exposed weaknesses in pilot judgment and tactical thinking. "You'll be facing multiple threat aircraft in a beyond visual range engagement. Your mission is to maintain air superiority while protecting a high-value target." Sarah ran through her pre-flight checklist with mechanical precision, every switch position verified against the procedures she had memorized during months of preparation. The F-22's cockpit was a marvel of ergonomic design, but it contained more systems and information displays than any fighter aircraft in history. Managing the flow of data while maintaining situational awareness during high-speed combat required a level of mental processing that separated exceptional pilots from those who became statistics. The scenario began with Sarah's aircraft positioned 50 miles from a formation of simulated enemy fighters approaching a civilian airliner that had strayed into contested airspace. Her mission was to intercept the threats before they could engage the commercial aircraft, using the F-22's superior radar and missile systems to neutralize enemies who wouldn't know she was there until it was too late. It was exactly the kind of situation that American fighter pilots trained for but hoped never to encounter in reality. "Raptor 2-1, you have multiple contacts bearing 030 at Angels 35, range 42 miles and closing," came the voice of the simulated air controller. "Designate hostile, weapons-free, repeat weapons-free." Sarah's pulse quickened as the tactical display painted a picture of the developing engagement. 4 enemy aircraft in loose formation, their radar signatures indicating advanced fighters with capabilities that would challenge even the F-22's technological advantages. The civilian airliner was 20 miles behind the enemy formation, flying straight and level without any indication that its crew was aware of the deadly drama unfolding around them. She advanced the throttles to military power, feeling the simulated thrust push her back into the ejection seat as the F-22 accelerated towards supersonic speed. The aircraft's stealth characteristics meant the enemy pilots had no idea they were being hunted, but that advantage would disappear the moment she fired her first missile. After that, it would become a close-range dogfight, where pilot skill mattered more than technological superiority. Contact, 4 aircraft in spread formation, Sarah transmitted, her voice steady despite the adrenaline surge that came with engaging multiple enemies. Engaging lead aircraft with AIM-120. The first missile fired with a satisfying thunk that vibrated through the simulator's structure. On her display, the weapon tracked toward its target with deadly precision, its active radar guidance system immune to the electronic countermeasures that might have defeated earlier generation missiles. The enemy formation began to react, breaking apart as their threat warning systems finally detected the incoming weapon. But Sarah had anticipated their response. While the first missile tracked toward the formation leader, she had already maneuvered to position herself for shots against the remaining aircraft. The F-22's fly-by-wire flight controls allowed her to maintain weapons lock while executing maneuvers that would have been impossible in older fighters. The aircraft's thrust vectoring system providing unprecedented agility in three-dimensional space. Splash 1, she announced as the first enemy aircraft disappeared from her display, engaging number 2 with AIM-120. The second missile launch triggered immediate responses from the surviving enemy pilots, who began defensive maneuvers designed to break weapons lock and force a close-range engagement where numbers might overcome technological advantages. Sarah found herself in exactly the kind of high-speed, high-G maneuvering fight that separated competent pilots from those who had the killer instinct necessary for air-to-air combat. On Chad. The simulation pushed her to physical limits that no training exercise could replicate. 9 G-turns that compressed her body into the ejection seat, with force that made breathing difficult. Negative G maneuvers that threw her against the shoulder straps while blood pooled in her head. All while maintaining the mental clarity necessary to track multiple targets, manage weapon systems, and make tactical decisions that determined whether she lived or died. 23 minutes after the engagement began, Sarah's aircraft emerged victorious from a dogfight that had tested every aspect of her flying ability. 4 enemy aircraft destroyed, the civilian airliner safely escorted out of the combat zone, and her own aircraft returning to base with minimal damage despite having been outnumbered 4-1. It was exactly the kind of performance that should have earned recognition from her instructors and respect from her classmates. Instead, Captain Sullivan's debrief focused on minor tactical decisions that he characterized as evidence of excessive caution during critical moments of the engagement. "Mitchell, your weapon employment was textbook perfect, but your maneuvering during the merge showed hesitation that could have been fatal in actual combat," he said, reviewing the recorded data from her simulation run. Air-to-air combat requires aggressive decision-making that doesn't leave room for second-guessing. Sarah felt her jaw tighten as she listened to criticism that seemed disconnected from the actual performance data displayed on Sullivan's monitor. Her reaction times had been faster than 90% of pilots who had run similar scenarios. Her weapon accuracy had been nearly perfect, and her tactical decisions had resulted in mission success with minimal risk to friendly aircraft. The suggestion that she had been overly cautious seemed designed to undermine her confidence, rather than provide constructive feedback. "Sir, could you be more specific about which maneuvers demonstrated hesitation?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled. "The data shows consistent aggressive positioning throughout the engagement." Sullivan's expression hardened slightly, as if her question represented insubordination rather than a legitimate request for clarification. "Mitchell, the difference between simulation and reality is that real enemies don't follow scripted behaviors. They adapt, they innovate, and they exploit any weakness they perceive in their opponents. The kind of measured decision-making that works in training can get you killed when someone is actively trying to murder you." The criticism stung because it seemed immune to objective analysis. No amount of performance data or tactical success could overcome subjective assessments that characterized her flying style as insufficiently aggressive for combat operations. Sarah began to understand that she was facing evaluation criteria that had less to do with measurable capability than with preconceived notions about how women approached high-stress situations. Over the following weeks, the pattern became unmistakable. Her academic scores were consistently at the top of the class, her technical knowledge was encyclopedic, and her simulator performance exceeded program standards in every measurable category. But her evaluations contained subtle criticisms that suggested underlying concerns about her suitability for combat operations that never seemed to apply to male students with inferior performance metrics. Captain Torres, whose tactical decision-making during simulator exercises was demonstrably slower and less effective than Sarah's, received praise for his aggressive instincts and warrior mentality. Lieutenant Brad Cooper, who had failed 2 academic examinations and required remedial training on weapons systems, was described as having "was fighter pilot instincts that would serve him well in combat situations." The double standard was so obvious that even some of the male students began to notice the disparity. "Mitchell, you're getting screwed," Torres said quietly after one particularly unfair evaluation session. "Your flying is better than 90% of the guys I've trained with, but they're treating you like you're barely qualified to be here. It's not right." The acknowledgement from a fellow student was gratifying, but it also highlighted the impossible position Sarah found herself in. Complaining about unfair treatment would be seen as making excuses for substandard performance, but accepting biased evaluations meant allowing her career to be damaged by prejudice rather than honest assessment of her capabilities. "Hello," her mother called that evening with news that made the situation even more frustrating. Dr. Elizabeth Mitchell had been contacted by colleagues at Lockheed Martin who were following the integration of women into F-22 squadrons with professional interest. "The engineers who designed the aircraft are very interested in performance data from female pilots," she told Sarah. "The physical differences in reaction times, spatial processing, and multitasking capabilities could provide valuable insights for future aircraft design." The irony was bitter. The same aerospace engineers who had created the F-22 were eager to learn from women's flying performance, while the military instructors responsible for training those pilots seemed determined to prove that women couldn't handle the responsibilities that came with flying their creation. But perhaps the most troubling development came during a weapons employment exercise that required split-second timing and absolute precision under extreme stress. Sarah's performance had been flawless, her missile employment more accurate than any student in the program's recent history. Yet Colonel Reynolds, who had been observing the exercise, made a comment that revealed the depth of his skepticism about women in combat roles. "Impressive technical execution," he said to Captain Sullivan, apparently unaware that Sarah could hear their conversation through the intercom system. "But I wonder how she'd perform when the stress is real, when she's being hunted by someone who wants to kill her." There's a difference between executing procedures perfectly and having the killer instinct necessary to take another human being's life. The comment crystallized everything Sarah had been sensing about the program's attitude toward her participation. No amount of demonstrated competence could overcome fundamental doubts about whether women possessed the psychological makeup necessary for lethal combat operations. She was being evaluated not just on her flying ability, but on assumptions about gender that had more to do with cultural prejudices than objective assessment of warrior capabilities. That night, Sarah lay in her quarters staring at the ceiling and wondering if her father had been wrong about merit ultimately triumphing over bias. The program that was supposed to identify the most capable fighter pilots seemed more interested in confirming pre-existing beliefs about gender roles than in honestly evaluating who could best serve in America's most critical air defense missions. But giving up meant accepting that the dream she had pursued her entire life was beyond reach, not because she lacked ability, but because she was a woman in a field where some people believed women couldn't succeed regardless of evidence to the contrary. And Sarah Mitchell had not spent years preparing for this opportunity only to surrender when the challenge proved more complex than she had anticipated. The sound of F-22s conducting night training exercises echoed across the base, their engines creating music that spoke to everything she had ever wanted to accomplish as a pilot. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to prove that excellence transcended the gender-based limitations that some people insisted on imposing. She had come too far to quit now, even if the path to proving herself led through obstacles that had nothing to do with flying ability and everything to do with changing minds that seemed determined to remain closed to possibilities they refused to consider. The Nevada test and training range stretched endlessly beneath Sarah's F-22 as she prepared for her first live-fire exercise, a milestone that would determine whether she advanced to the final phase of the program or was quietly reassigned to transport duties. The airspace above the Mojave Desert had witnessed decades of military aviation history, from the early jet age through the development of stealth technology that made the Raptor invisible to enemy radar systems. Today's exercise would test her ability to engage multiple air and ground targets while coordinating with other aircraft in a complex scenario designed to simulate actual combat conditions. Unlike the sterile environment of simulator training, this mission would involve real weapons, real G-forces, and the kind of three-dimensional thinking that separated exceptional pilots from those who simply followed procedures. "Raptor flight, this is control," came the voice of the range officer through her helmet speakers. "You are cleared hot on range Charlie 7. Multiple air targets inbound from the northwest. Ground targets designated by laser designator. Mission time is 45 minutes. Weapons are live. Repeat, weapons are live." Sarah acknowledged the transmission while scanning her tactical display for the enemy aircraft that were already maneuvering into attack positions. Flying as Raptor 2, she was part of a four-ship formation led by Captain Michael Torres, whose own progression through the program had been smooth despite performance metrics that consistently lagged behind Sarah's scores. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was flying wing to a pilot she had outperformed in every measurable category. The first threat appeared on her display as a fast-moving contact approaching from the north, its electronic signature indicating an advanced fighter aircraft whose capabilities would challenge even the F-22's technological advantages. Sarah's pulse quickened as she realized this wasn't just another training exercise. The range officers had hired former Soviet pilots flying actual MiG-29 aircraft to provide the kind of realistic opposition that no simulation could replicate. "Contact bearing 010, Angels 28, range 35 miles. Sarah transmitted, her voice steady despite the adrenaline surge that came with engaging real adversaries who had trained their entire careers to kill American pilots. "Requesting permission to engage." Torres hesitated for nearly 3 seconds before responding, a delay that in actual combat could have meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. "Raptor 2, hold fire until we can confirm hostile intent." The hesitation revealed exactly the kind of indecisiveness that Sarah had been criticized for during simulator training, yet, when displayed by the flight leader, it was apparently considered prudent tactical thinking. She maintained weapons lock on the approaching aircraft while monitoring the tactical situation that was developing around them with frightening speed. The MiG pilot proved to be everything the intelligence briefings had suggested: aggressive, innovative, and utterly committed to testing the limits of American air superiority. His aircraft pulled into a vertical climb that would have been impossible with older generation fighters, then rolled inverted and dove toward the F-22 formation with the kind of tactical audacity that demanded immediate response. "Raptor lead, recommend immediate engagement." Sarah transmitted as the enemy aircraft closed to weapons range. Hostile is maneuvering for firing position. But Torres was already behind the tactical curve, his decision-making compromised by the complexity of managing multiple threats while flying an aircraft that demanded complete pilot attention. The MiG fired first, launching a simulated missile that would have destroyed the lead aircraft if the exercise had been using live warheads instead of training rounds. Sarah didn't wait for permission. Her training had emphasized that air-to-air combat required split-second decisions that couldn't be delayed by bureaucratic procedures or concerns about chain of command. She fired an AIM-120 missile that tracked toward the enemy aircraft with deadly precision, its sophisticated guidance system immune to the electronic countermeasures that had defeated earlier generation weapons. "Splash 1," she announced as the MiG pilot acknowledged the simulated kill and departed the exercise area. "Raptor led, you've been notionally destroyed by hostile missile fire." The range officer's voice cut through the radio chatter with an announcement that sent shockwaves through everyone monitoring the exercise. Raptor 2 has successfully engaged and destroyed the primary threat aircraft. Raptor lead has been assessed as destroyed by enemy action. Raptor 2 assume flight lead for remainder of exercise. Sarah found herself in command of the remaining F-22s in a scenario that was rapidly escalating beyond anything the program instructors had anticipated. 3 more enemy aircraft were approaching from different vectors, their pilots clearly determined to test every aspect of American air superiority capabilities. The ground targets were defended by simulated surface-to-air missile systems that could destroy any aircraft whose pilot made tactical errors or showed hesitation during the attack runs. What followed was 43 minutes of the most intense flying Sarah had ever experienced. Leading a formation of fighters against multiple threats while maintaining situational awareness of ground-based dangers required the kind of three-dimensional thinking that pushed human cognitive abilities to their absolute limits. Every decision had consequences that rippled through the tactical situation, and every mistake could result in simulated casualties that would end military careers. She destroyed 2 more enemy aircraft during high-speed, high-G dogfights that tested every aspect of her flying ability. Her weapons employment was precise and efficient, her tactical decisions were innovative without being reckless, and her leadership of the remaining aircraft demonstrated exactly the kind of aggressive competence that the program was supposed to identify and develop. The ground attack phase required different skills entirely. Diving toward heavily defended targets at nearly supersonic speed while enemy missiles tracked toward her aircraft, Sarah had to balance the need for accurate weapons delivery against the survival instincts that demanded immediate, evasive action. She successfully destroyed 3 high-value targets while avoiding simulated surface-to-air missiles that would have killed less capable pilots. When the exercise concluded, Sarah's aircraft had accounted for 5 air-to-air kills and 3 ground targets destroyed, leading a formation that had achieved complete mission success despite losing its original leader in the opening moments of engagement. It was exactly the kind of performance that should have established her reputation as one of the program's most promising students. Instead, the debrief focused on her decision to fire without explicit permission from the flight leader, characterizing her initiative as a violation of proper procedures that could have resulted in friendly fire incidents in actual combat situations. Colonel Reynolds led the critique with the kind of cold disapproval that made it clear he viewed her performance as evidence of exactly the kind of reckless decision-making he expected from female pilots under pressure. Mitchell, your weapon employment was technically proficient, but your failure to follow established command protocols represents a fundamental misunderstanding of how air-to-air operations are conducted, Reynolds said, his voice carrying the authority of someone whose combat experience gave him the right to judge pilot performance. In actual combat, discipline and adherence to procedures are more important than individual heroics. Sarah felt the familiar frustration of being criticized for actions that would have been praised if performed by a male pilot. Torres's hesitation and subsequent simulated death were characterized as the result of quote-unquote prudent tactical thinking overwhelmed by enemy aggression, while her life-saving intervention was described as quote-unquote failure to respect command authority during critical decision-making moments. But the most telling criticism came from Major Lisa Thompson, whose own flight background was limited to transport aircraft and whose knowledge of air-to-air combat was entirely theoretical. Mitchell, we're concerned about your tendency to take unnecessary risks during high-stress situations. Combat operations require measured decision-making, not the kind of impulsive actions that might work in training but could prove disastrous when American lives are at stake. The irony was staggering. Sarah's split-second decision to engage the enemy aircraft had saved the flight leader's life and enabled mission success, yet it was being characterized as evidence of poor judgment and inappropriate risk-taking. The double standard was so obvious that even the range officers who had monitored the exercise were beginning to question the evaluation criteria being applied to her performance. Chief Master Sergeant Robert Hayes, the senior enlisted advisor who had overseen thousands of training missions, made a comment that summarized what everyone had witnessed. In 30 years of monitoring live-fire exercises, I've rarely seen a pilot handle multiple threats with that level of tactical innovation and weapons accuracy. If that performance is considered inadequate, then we need to reconsider what we're looking for in fighter pilots. But institutional momentum was already working against honest evaluation of Sarah's capabilities. Too many careers and too much organizational pride were invested in the assumption that women couldn't handle the psychological pressures of lethal combat operations. Acknowledging that Sarah had just demonstrated exactly the kind of combat leadership the program was designed to identify would require admitting that gender-based assumptions had been wrong from the beginning. That evening, Sarah received a phone call that provided perspective on the broader implications of her situation. Her father's former squadron commander, Brigadier General Robert Martinez, had been following her progress through informal military networks that still connected pilots across generational and service boundaries. "Sarah, I've been hearing about your training performance from people who were involved in developing the F-22 program," General Martinez said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had spent decades evaluating pilot capabilities. "What you accomplished today was exactly what we designed that aircraft to do when flown by pilots with exceptional skill and tactical understanding." The validation from a senior officer who had no stake in program politics was gratifying, but it also highlighted the disconnect between objective performance assessment and the institutional resistance she was facing at Edwards. Excellence wasn't enough when the people evaluating that excellence were committed to conclusions that had nothing to do with demonstrated capability. "General, how do I succeed in a system that seems determined to prove I can't succeed regardless of how well I perform?" Sarah asked, voicing the question that had been consuming her thoughts for weeks. "By continuing to be so undeniably good at what you do that even the skeptics eventually run out of arguments," Martinez replied. "But Sarah, you need to understand that changing institutional culture takes time, and sometimes it requires external pressure that forces organizations to confront their own biases." As Sarah prepared for the final phase of training that would determine her fate in the program, she understood that the real test wasn't mastering the F-22's complex systems or proving her tactical knowledge. The real test was whether the United States Air Force was ready to acknowledge that exceptional fighter pilots could emerge from sources that traditional thinking hadn't considered, and whether merit could triumph over prejudice when American air superiority depended on finding the best pilots regardless of gender. The emergency klaxon pierced the pre-dawn silence at Edwards Air Force Base with the kind of urgency that meant real crisis, not training exercise. Sarah bolted upright in her quarters, muscle memory from years of military service already reaching for her flight suit, before her mind fully processed what was happening. Through her window, she could see maintenance crews racing toward the flight line with the controlled chaos that indicated an actual scramble rather than scheduled operations. Her phone rang with the harsh electronic tone reserved for emergency notifications. "Mitchell, report to the operations center immediately," came the voice of Major Thompson, her usual administrative tone replaced by the clipped urgency of someone coordinating a developing crisis. "We have a real-world situation that requires immediate response." Sarah dressed quickly, her mind racing through the possibilities that could trigger an emergency response during what should have been routine training operations. As she jogged toward the operations center, she noticed that the normal base activities had been replaced by the kind of focused activity that indicated something significant was happening beyond the controlled environment of pilot training. The operations center was in full crisis mode when she arrived, filled with personnel coordinating what was obviously a major emergency response. Multiple radio conversations crackled simultaneously while officers huddled around tactical displays, showing a situation that was developing faster than anyone had anticipated. The atmosphere carried the electric tension of professionals dealing with events that could have national security implications. "Mitchell, over here," called Colonel Reynolds, his usual dismissive attitude replaced by the focused intensity of a combat veteran facing a situation that required every available resource. "We've got 5 unidentified aircraft that have penetrated American airspace approximately 200 miles northwest of here. They're not responding to radio contact, they're not squawking identification codes, and their flight profile suggests hostile intent." Sarah felt her pulse quicken as she absorbed the implications of what Reynolds was describing. Hostile aircraft in American airspace represented exactly the kind of threat that the F-22 program was designed to counter, but it also meant that the theoretical training scenarios she had been mastering were about to become deadly reality, with consequences that extended far beyond program evaluation. "Intelligence analysis suggests these are advanced fighters, possibly MiG-35s with upgraded avionics packages," continued Major Thompson, her voice tight with the stress of coordinating a response to a situation that no one had expected to develop during routine training operations. "Their approach vector suggests they're probing our air defense response times and capabilities, but we can't rule out the possibility that this is a precursor to something larger." The tactical display painted a picture that made Sarah's training instincts engage immediately. 5 aircraft in loose formation, approaching at high altitude and moderate speed, their electronic signatures indicating sophisticated fighters with capabilities that would challenge even the F-22's technological advantages. More troubling was their flight path, which would take them directly over sensitive military installations if they weren't intercepted and turned away. "What's our response capability?" Sarah asked, already knowing that the answer would involve the F-22s based at Edwards, despite the ongoing training program that had most of the aircraft configured for instructional rather than combat operations. Colonel Reynolds' expression was grim as he outlined the tactical situation that was forcing impossible decisions on everyone involved in the program. We have 3 F-22s immediately available for scramble, but here's the problem. The pilots who would normally handle this kind of mission are all grounded. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow as she began to understand the scope of the crisis developing around them. Grounded? What happened? Training accident yesterday during advanced maneuvering exercises, Thompson explained, her voice carrying the strain of someone dealing with cascading problems that had no good solutions. Captain Torres, Lieutenant Cooper, and Lieutenant Watson all suffered varying degrees of injury when their aircraft experienced uncommanded flight control inputs during high-G maneuvers. They're all hospitalized, none of them are cleared for flight operations. Sarah's mind raced as she processed the implications of what she was hearing. The 3 pilots who had been designated as the program's most promising candidates were unavailable exactly when their skills were needed most, leaving a gap in air defense capabilities that could have catastrophic consequences if the approaching aircraft proved to be more than a reconnaissance probe. What about the other students in the program, she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Reynolds shook his head with the expression of someone facing options that ranged from bad to worse. Lieutenant Murphy failed his final evaluation last week and has been reassigned. Captain Rodriguez is qualified, but he's at Nellis Air Force Base participating in red flag exercises. That leaves us with a significant problem. The tactical display continued to track the approaching aircraft, their steady progress toward American territory creating time pressure that was forcing decisions no one wanted to make. Sarah realized that she was looking at exactly the kind of emergency that tested institutional priorities when real-world consequences collided with bureaucratic procedures and personal prejudices. "Sir, what about pilots from other bases? Can we get qualified F-22 pilots here quickly enough to respond?" Sarah asked, though she was already calculating flight times and response delays that would make external assistance impossible given the developing timeline. "Negative," Thompson replied, checking her watch with the expression of someone watching available options disappear minute by minute. The nearest F-22 squadron is at Langley Air Force Base in Virginia. Even if they launched immediately, they couldn't reach the intercept point before the hostile aircraft penetrated restricted airspace over critical facilities. Sarah felt the weight of the situation settling on her shoulders as she began to understand why she had been called to the operations center. Despite months of criticism about her readiness for combat operations, despite evaluations that questioned her suitability for fighter pilot duties, she was about to be asked to defend American airspace against real enemies flying real aircraft with real weapons. "Mitchell," Reynolds said, his voice carrying the reluctant recognition of someone forced to confront the contradiction between his personal beliefs and operational necessities. "You're the only pilot immediately available who's current on F-22 systems and tactics. I need to know if you're ready to fly a combat mission against aircraft that will be trying to kill you." The question hung in the air like smoke from burning jet fuel. Everything Sarah had trained for, everything she had endured during months of unfair evaluation and institutional resistance, had led to this moment when her country needed her skills regardless of anyone's opinions about gender roles in combat aviation. "Sir, I'm ready," she replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline surge that came with accepting responsibility for a mission that would determine whether hostile aircraft succeeded in penetrating American airspace. "I've been preparing for exactly this kind of situation my entire career." Reynolds studied her face for a long moment, searching for any sign of doubt or hesitation that would justify his long-standing skepticism about her combat readiness. What he saw was the focused determination of a pilot who had spent years preparing for opportunities that institutional prejudice had repeatedly denied. Someone who understood that excellence meant being ready to perform when lives and national security depended on capability rather than conventional expectations. "Major Thompson, get Mitchell suited up and brief her on current intelligence regarding the approaching aircraft," Reynolds ordered, his voice carrying the reluctant acknowledgement that operational requirements were overriding personal preferences. "And contact the Pentagon. They need to know we're launching a female pilot in an F-22 against unidentified aircraft of unknown capability and intent." As Sarah headed toward the equipment room to don her flight gear, she caught fragments of heated telephone conversations that revealed the broader implications of what was about to happen. Senior officers at multiple levels were grappling with the political and military consequences of sending a woman into air-to-air combat for the first time in American military history, while simultaneously dealing with a developing threat that required immediate response regardless of historical precedent. The flight suit felt different this time, heavier with the weight of real responsibility rather than training evaluation. Sarah ran through her equipment checks with mechanical precision while her mind processed the tactical parameters that would determine success or failure during the mission ahead. 5 enemy aircraft with unknown capabilities flying over American territory with hostile intent, and only 1 F-22 available to respond. Major Thompson approached with the final intelligence briefing that would guide Sarah's tactical decisions during the engagement. Mitchell, signal intelligence suggests these aircraft are equipped with advanced electronic warfare systems and beyond visual range missiles comparable to our own capabilities. This isn't going to be like training scenarios where enemy aircraft follow predictable patterns. Sarah absorbed the details of enemy capabilities while calculating approach vectors and engagement scenarios that would maximize her advantages, while minimizing exposure to weapon systems that could destroy her aircraft if she made tactical errors. The F-22's stealth characteristics would provide initial surprise, but after the first missile launch, the engagement would become a test of pilot skill against adversaries who had trained their entire careers to kill American airmen. "Ma'am, one more thing," Thompson added, her expression showing the strain of someone coordinating the first female combat mission in fighter aviation history. "The entire engagement is being monitored by senior leadership up to and including the Pentagon. Your performance today will be analyzed by people who are making decisions about the future of women in combat aviation." The additional pressure was unnecessary. Sarah already understood that she was flying not just to defend American airspace, but to prove that women could handle the lethal responsibilities that came with air superiority missions. Everything she had worked for, everything she had endured during months of unfair treatment, would be decided by her performance during the next hour of flying against enemies who wanted her dead. As she walked toward the F-22 that would carry her into combat, Sarah felt the familiar surge of confidence that came from knowing she was completely prepared for the challenge ahead. The aircraft sitting on the ramp represented the pinnacle of American military technology, but it was only as effective as the pilot who could integrate its systems into a coherent fighting platform. In 30 minutes, she would discover whether excellence could triumph over prejudice when the stakes involved real bullets and real consequences for American national security. The F-22's twin Pratt & Whitney engines spun up with a sound that spoke of barely contained violence, their combined 70,000 pounds of thrust creating vibrations that Sarah could feel through the aircraft's structure as she completed her final pre-flight checks. Every system reading was perfect, every weapon status light showed green, and the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world was ready to prove whether its female pilot possessed the killer instinct that months of training evaluations had questioned. "Raptor 01, you are cleared for immediate departure," came the voice of the tower controller, his usual routine professionalism replaced by the clipped urgency of someone coordinating a real-world emergency. "Vector 270, climb to flight level 400, contact approach control on tactical frequency." Sarah acknowledged the clearance while advancing the throttles to military power, feeling the F-22 surge forward with acceleration that pressed her back into the ejection seat. The aircraft lifted off Edwards' runway with the effortless grace that made it seem more like a natural predator than a machine built by human engineering, its fly-by-wire flight controls translating her intentions into precise movements through three-dimensional space. Climbing through 30,000 feet, Sarah's tactical display began painting a picture of the developing engagement that would test everything she had learned about air-to-air combat. The 5 hostile aircraft were maintaining their westward course towards sensitive military installations, their formation loose enough to suggest sophisticated tactical thinking rather than simple reconnaissance probing. "Raptor 01, this is magic," came the voice of the AWACS controller whose radar picture provided Sarah with situational awareness that extended far beyond her own sensors. "Bandits are currently bearing 285 at Angels 32, range 68 miles and closing. Signal intelligence indicates active jamming attempts against our ground-based radar systems." The electronic warfare activity confirmed Sarah's growing suspicion that these weren't routine border probes or navigation errors, but a coordinated test of American air defense capabilities by pilots who understood exactly what they were doing. The jamming suggested they were equipped with sophisticated electronic countermeasures, that could complicate her weapons employment and force a close-range engagement where pilot skill mattered more than technological advantages. Mach Raptor 01 requests picture. Sarah transmitted, using the standardized terminology that would provide her with detailed information about enemy aircraft positions and capabilities. Raptor 01, picture shows 5 contacts in loose deuce formation, lead element at 32,000, trail element at 28,000. Estimated aircraft type is MiG-35 with advanced avionics package. Signal analysis indicates active radar and infrared search systems. Sarah processed the tactical intelligence while calculating approach vectors that would maximize her stealth advantages during the initial engagement. The MiG-35 was a formidable adversary, equipped with beyond visual range missiles and maneuverability that could challenge even the F-22 in close combat. More troubling was the formation structure, which suggested the enemy pilots were using tactics specifically designed to counter American air superiority fighters. At 40 miles range, Sarah's own radar began detecting the hostile aircraft, despite their attempts at electronic concealment. The F-22's advanced sensor fusion systems combined radar, infrared, and electronic intelligence into a tactical picture that provided unprecedented situational awareness, but it also revealed that she was facing opponents who were using sophisticated countermeasures to mask their true capabilities. Mach Raptor 01 has contact on lead element, requesting weapons free. Sarah transmitted as her fire control system achieved lock-on against the formation leader. Raptor 01, you are weapons free. Engage hostile aircraft. ROE is weapons tight against unknown contacts until hostile intent is confirmed. The rules of engagement meant Sarah couldn't fire until the enemy aircraft demonstrated clearly hostile intentions. But their continued penetration of restricted airspace while jamming American radar systems already suggested they weren't on a peaceful mission. She positioned her aircraft for optimal weapons employment while monitoring for any indication that the enemy formation was preparing to engage American targets. The answer came 30 seconds later when the lead MiG-35 fired an R-77 missile toward what intelligence analysis would later reveal was a test shot designed to evaluate American reaction times and defensive capabilities. The missile wasn't targeted at Sarah's aircraft, but its launch confirmed hostile intent and triggered the engagement that would become the most analyzed air-to-air combat in modern military history. Raptor 01 Rifle. Sarah announced as she fired her first AIM-120 missile toward the enemy formation leader. The weapon separated from her aircraft with mechanical precision, its active radar guidance system immune to the electronic countermeasures that had defeated earlier generation missiles. The enemy formation reacted immediately, breaking apart in directions that revealed tactical coordination and situational awareness that exceeded anything Sarah had encountered during training exercises. These weren't pilots flying predictable patterns from a training manual. They were combat veterans who understood exactly how to exploit the F-22's weaknesses while maximizing their own aircraft's capabilities. The engagement developed into a three-dimensional chess match played at supersonic speeds, with each pilot maneuvering for tactical advantage while managing weapon systems that could destroy aircraft from ranges measured in tens of miles. Sarah's first missile found its target with devastating effectiveness, the enemy formation leader disappearing from her tactical display in a fireball that marked the first confirmed air-to-air kill by a female pilot in American military history. But the 4 surviving MiGs immediately adapted their tactics, using coordinated maneuvers that forced Sarah into defensive positioning while they attempted to achieve weapons lock with their own beyond visual range missiles. She found herself fighting a battle of geometry and physics, using the F-22's superior climb rate and acceleration to maintain tactical advantage, while avoiding the missile engagement zones that could prove fatal. Mach Raptor 01, Splash 1 Bandit 4 remaining hostile maneuvering for second engagement. Sarah transmitted while pulling 7 gigaseconds in a climbing turn that would have been impossible in any other fighter aircraft. The second engagement required different tactics entirely. The surviving enemy pilots had abandoned their original mission and were now focused entirely on destroying the American fighter that had disrupted their formation. Sarah found herself in exactly the kind of multi-threat environment that training scenarios had prepared her for, but with the added complexity that real enemies adapted and innovated in ways that simulated opponents never could. She destroyed the second aircraft with a combination of superior positioning and precise weapons employment, but the engagement forced her into a turning fight with the remaining 3 MiGs that tested every aspect of her flying ability. 9G turns that compressed her body into the ejection seat, -G maneuvers that threw blood into her head, all while maintaining the mental clarity necessary to track multiple targets and make tactical decisions that determined whether she lived or died. The third kill came during a high-speed dive that took her aircraft to the edge of its performance envelope, her missile finding its target as the enemy pilot attempted to escape toward the deck where terrain masking might provide concealment. But the maneuver left Sarah in a vulnerable position, her aircraft low on fuel and ammunition while still facing two highly capable opponents who had learned from watching their wingmen die. What followed was the kind of close-range dogfight that fighter pilots had trained for but hoped never to experience. Distances measured in hundreds of yards rather than miles, cannon fire instead of guided missiles, and maneuvering that pushed both aircraft and pilots to the absolute limits of human and mechanical capability. Sarah's training in the F-22's thrust vectoring system proved decisive, allowing her to achieve firing positions that would have been impossible in conventional fighters. The fourth aircraft fell to cannon fire during a horizontal scissors maneuver that demonstrated exactly the kind of aggressive decision-making that her training evaluations had claimed she lacked. But the engagement left her aircraft low on fuel, and facing a final opponent who had used the previous fights to study her tactics and identify potential weaknesses in her approach to air-to-air combat. The final engagement lasted 8 minutes and covered nearly 200 miles of Nevada airspace, as both pilots used every tactical innovation and aircraft capability available to achieve killing position on their opponent. Sarah's victory came through a combination of superior aircraft performance, flawless weapons employment, and the kind of tactical thinking that emerged from complete preparation rather than inherited privilege. When the last enemy aircraft disappeared from her tactical display, Sarah found herself alone in airspace that had witnessed the most successful air-to-air engagement by a single pilot since the Vietnam War. 5 enemy aircraft destroyed, American airspace defended, and every assumption about women in combat aviation proven catastrophically wrong by 47 minutes of flying that would be studied by tactical experts for decades. Mach Raptor 01, all bandits destroyed, returning to base. She transmitted, her voice steady despite the physical and emotional exhaustion that came with surviving combat against multiple opponents who had been trying to kill her. The response from the AWACS controller carried amazement that transcended normal radio discipline. Raptor 01, Mach copies 5 bandits destroyed. Outstanding performance. Vector 120 for recovery at Edwards, you've got priority handling and a hero's welcome waiting. As Sarah turned toward home, she understood that everything had changed during those 47 minutes. The pilot who had been dismissed as inadequately aggressive for combat operations had just completed the most successful air-to-air mission in modern American military history, proving that excellence transcended every assumption about gender limitations in fighter aviation. But more than personal vindication, her performance had demonstrated that the United States Air Force had been wrong about fundamental questions regarding who could serve as guardians of American airspace. The institutional resistance that had characterized her training experience was about to confront evidence that no amount of prejudice could explain away or minimize. The F-22 that carried her home was the same aircraft that had lifted off from Edwards 90 minutes earlier, but the pilot returning from combat was someone who had proven herself in the most definitive way possible when American national security depended on exceptional performance rather than conventional expectations. The Edwards Air Force Base flight line had been transformed into something resembling a victory celebration by the time Sarah's F-22 touched down, its landing gear kissing the runway with the gentle precision of an aircraft that had just made military aviation history. Ground crews, maintenance personnel, and every available officer on base had gathered to witness the return of a pilot whose performance had shattered decades of assumptions about women in combat aviation. As Sarah taxied toward the designated parking spot, she could see Colonel Reynolds standing among the crowd with an expression that mixed disbelief with the kind of grudging recognition that came from watching preconceived notions collapse under the weight of undeniable evidence. Beside him stood officers from the Pentagon who had arrived during her mission to monitor what was supposed to be a routine intercept, but had become the most significant air-to-air engagement of the 21st century. The F-22's engines wound down with the distinctive whine of turbines designed for supersonic flight, their silence marking the end of a mission that would be analyzed by military historians and tactical experts for generations. Sarah completed her post-flight checklist with mechanical precision while her mind processed the reality of what had just occurred. She had engaged and destroyed 5 enemy aircraft in single combat, proving her capabilities in the most definitive way possible. General Patricia Harrison stepped forward as Sarah climbed down from the cockpit, her 4 stars indicating the level of attention this mission had attracted from the highest levels of military leadership. Harrison had flown F-16s during the early days of women's integration into fighter squadrons and understood better than most the significance of what had just transpired over Nevada airspace. "Captain Mitchell," General Harrison said, her voice carrying the formal weight of someone delivering an official statement that would be recorded and transmitted throughout the military chain of command. "On behalf of the United States Air Force and the American people, I want to express our gratitude for your exceptional performance during today's mission. Your actions have successfully defended American airspace and eliminated a significant threat to national security." The formal recognition was gratifying, but Sarah could see in the faces surrounding her that the real impact of her mission extended far beyond military protocol. She had proven something that institutional resistance had spent months denying: that women could handle the lethal responsibilities of air-to-air combat with the same deadly effectiveness as their male counterparts. Major Thompson approached with a tablet displaying preliminary analysis of the engagement, her expression showing the kind of professional amazement that came from witnessing performance that exceeded every training metric. "Captain, the tactical data from your mission is remarkable. 5 confirmed kills against advanced fighters, 0 friendly casualties, and mission completion under conditions that would have challenged even our most experienced pilots." Sarah studied the flight data that documented every maneuver, every weapons employment, and every tactical decision she had made during the 47 minutes of combat. The numbers told a story of precision and innovation that transcended anything the training program had anticipated, demonstrating capabilities that institutional prejudice had insisted didn't exist. But perhaps the most significant moment came when Colonel Reynolds approached with the kind of expression worn by someone forced to confront the complete inadequacy of his previous judgments. The man who had spent months questioning Sarah's readiness for combat operations was now facing a pilot who had just achieved the most successful air-to-air mission in modern American military history. "Captain Mitchell," Reynolds said, his voice carrying the weight of someone delivering an apology that could never adequately address the damage caused by months of institutional resistance. "I need to acknowledge that my assessment of your combat readiness was fundamentally flawed. Your performance today demonstrates capabilities that exceed anything we expected from pilots at your experience level." The admission was more than Sarah had ever expected to hear from an officer whose skepticism had shaped her entire training experience. But it also represented something larger: institutional acknowledgement that gender-based assumptions about combat capability had been wrong from the beginning. Within hours of Sarah's return, preliminary reports of her mission were being transmitted to senior leadership throughout the Department of Defense, creating shockwaves that would reshape military aviation policy at the highest levels. The pilot who had been dismissed as inadequately aggressive for combat operations had just proven that women could excel in roles that conventional wisdom had insisted were beyond their capabilities. Dr. Elizabeth Mitchell received the news through unofficial channels that connected military families across generational and service boundaries. Her daughter had not only vindicated years of preparation and training, but had proven that the aerospace engineers who designed the F-22 had been right to believe that exceptional pilots could emerge from sources that traditional thinking hadn't considered. Sarah's mission data is going to revolutionize how we think about pilot selection and training, Dr. Mitchell told her husband during one of their evening conversations. The tactical innovations she demonstrated during those engagements are already being incorporated into advanced training scenarios for other F-22 pilots. But the broader implications extended beyond individual recognition or program validation. Sarah's performance had demonstrated that the United States Air Force had been systematically excluding potential pilots whose capabilities exceeded those of the men who had been selected based on assumptions rather than demonstrated competence. The investigation that followed her mission revealed disturbing patterns in pilot evaluation and selection that had prevented qualified women from advancing to combat roles throughout the military aviation community. Colonel Reynolds found himself facing questions about evaluation criteria that had consistently rated inferior male pilots above superior female candidates, creating gaps in air defense capabilities that could have proven catastrophic if real combat had revealed these disparities. Captain Torres, recovering from his training injuries, made a statement that reflected the growing recognition among male pilots that institutional bias had damaged everyone involved in the program. "Captain Mitchell consistently outperformed every pilot in our class, but the evaluation system was designed to ignore objective performance data in favor of subjective assessments that reflected personal prejudices rather than tactical capability. The admission from a pilot who had been selected over Sarah for advancement highlighted the systemic nature of problems that extended far beyond individual attitudes or isolated incidents of discrimination. The entire pilot selection and training system had been compromised by assumptions that had no relationship to actual combat effectiveness. Major Lisa Thompson submitted a detailed report documenting the disparities between Sarah's objective performance and her subjective evaluations, providing evidence that would be used to reform training programs throughout the Air Force. The disconnect between Captain Mitchell's demonstrated capabilities and her program evaluations represents a failure of institutional integrity that could have compromised national security if we had continued to exclude pilots of her caliber from combat roles. Perhaps the most damaging revelation came when investigators discovered that Sarah's training evaluations had been deliberately altered to reflect concerns about emotional stability under pressure and insufficient aggressive instincts for combat operations, criticisms that her mission performance had proven to be completely fabricated. The falsified evaluations revealed that institutional resistance to women in combat aviation had reached levels that compromised professional integrity and threatened operational effectiveness. Officers who had sworn to defend the Constitution had instead worked to exclude qualified defenders based on prejudices that had no basis in demonstrated capability. General Harrison convened a formal review board to examine pilot selection criteria throughout the Air Force, with specific attention to identifying and correcting gender-based discrimination that had prevented qualified women from serving in combat roles. Sarah's mission had provided undeniable proof that current evaluation methods were fundamentally flawed and required complete restructuring. The review board's preliminary findings were damning. Dozens of qualified female pilots had been excluded from advanced training programs based on evaluation criteria that had no relationship to combat effectiveness, while less qualified male pilots had been advanced based on assumptions about gender-based capabilities that Sarah's performance had proven catastrophically wrong. But beyond institutional reform, Sarah's mission had created a new standard for air-to-air combat effectiveness that would influence pilot training for decades. Her tactical innovations during the multi-aircraft engagement were being incorporated into training scenarios designed to prepare future pilots for the kind of complex combat situations that modern warfare demanded. The F-22 program that had rejected her as unqualified was now using her mission data to train pilots who would defend American airspace against increasingly sophisticated threats. The aircraft that had been denied to her based on gender bias was now being flown by pilots learning tactics that she had developed during actual combat against multiple opponents. As Sarah reflected on the events that had transformed her from a dismissed trainee to a combat legend, she understood that her mission had accomplished something beyond personal vindication. She had proven that American air superiority depended on finding the best pilots regardless of gender, and that institutional prejudices were luxuries that the nation couldn't afford when its security depended on exceptional performance rather than traditional expectations. The woman who had been told that certain doors weren't meant for everyone had not only opened those doors, but had redefined what lay beyond them, creating opportunities for future generations of female pilots who would never face the institutional resistance that had nearly prevented her from serving her country in the role she was born to fill. The Pentagon's war room had witnessed countless briefings over the decades, but few had generated the level of intense discussion surrounding the preliminary analysis of Sarah Mitchell's combat mission. Secretary of Defense James Morrison sat at the head of the mahogany conference table, surrounded by the Joint Chiefs of Staff and senior officials whose decades of military experience had never prepared them for the implications of what had occurred over Nevada airspace. "Gentlemen, ladies," Secretary Morrison began, his voice carrying the gravity of someone addressing a watershed moment in American military history. "What we're discussing today will fundamentally reshape how this nation approaches combat aviation and pilot selection. Captain Mitchell's performance has forced us to confront uncomfortable truths about our own institutional biases and their impact on national security." The tactical analysis displayed on the main screen told a story that transcended individual achievement and spoke to systemic failures that had compromised American air superiority for years. Sarah's engagement against 5 advanced fighters represented the kind of tactical excellence that the military's most sophisticated selection processes had somehow failed to identify, despite her superior performance in every measurable category. General Robert Hayes, the Air Force Chief of Staff, presented data that painted a disturbing picture of how gender bias had infiltrated pilot evaluation systems throughout the service. Our investigation has revealed that Captain Mitchell's case was not isolated. We have documented evidence of qualified female pilots being systematically excluded from advanced training programs across multiple installations, while less qualified male candidates were advanced based on subjective evaluations that reflected cultural prejudices rather than combat potential. The revelation sent shockwaves through the military leadership community, forcing senior officers to confront the possibility that their pursuit of the best pilots had been compromised by unconscious biases that prioritized tradition over capability. The implications extended far beyond individual careers to questions about whether American Air Forces were as effective as they could be if institutional barriers were preventing the best pilots from serving in critical roles. Admiral Sarah Chen, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, addressed the broader strategic implications with the directness that had characterized her rise to the highest levels of military leadership. The enemy aircraft that Captain Mitchell engaged were equipped with advanced technology and flown by pilots who had trained specifically to counter American air superiority. The fact that our best male pilots were unavailable while a woman they had deemed unqualified successfully defended American airspace should terrify everyone in this room. The tactical data revealed something even more concerning than individual discrimination. It showed that institutional bias had created vulnerabilities in American air defense that hostile nations could have exploited if they had understood the full scope of pilot selection problems. Enemy intelligence services had likely assumed that American fighter squadrons represented the absolute best pilots available, when in reality they represented the best pilots who fit traditional cultural expectations. Dr. Patricia Williams, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, presented analysis that connected Sarah's case to broader patterns of discrimination that had affected military effectiveness across multiple service branches. Our preliminary research suggests that gender-based exclusion from combat roles has prevented the military from accessing approximately 30% of the talent pool available for critical specialties. We have been fighting with one hand tied behind our backs by our own prejudices. The economic implications were staggering. The military had invested hundreds of millions of dollars in training programs designed to identify the best pilots, while simultaneously excluding candidates whose capabilities exceeded those of the pilots they were selecting. The F-22 program alone represented a $67 billion investment in technology that was only as effective as the pilots who flew it, yet the pilot selection process had been compromised by biases that had nothing to do with combat effectiveness. Colonel Reynolds found himself summoned to Washington to explain evaluation procedures that had consistently rated inferior male pilots above superior female candidates throughout his tenure as program commander. His testimony before the review panel revealed the depth of institutional resistance that had shaped pilot selection for decades. "Sir, I believe that combat aviation required psychological characteristics that were more commonly found in male pilots," Reynolds admitted during questioning that would effectively end his military career. "I assessed female candidates based on assumptions about stress response and aggressive decision-making that I now understand were completely unfounded." The admission confirmed what the investigation had already revealed through analysis of training records and performance data. Sarah Mitchell had been the most qualified pilot in her class by every objective measure, yet she had been consistently rated as inadequately prepared for combat operations by evaluators whose judgments had been influenced by gender-based assumptions rather than demonstrated capability. General Martinez, who had followed Sarah's progress through informal military networks, provided testimony that highlighted the disconnect between official evaluations and actual performance. Captain Mitchell's tactical knowledge, weapons employment accuracy, and decision-making under pressure exceeded standards that would have qualified her for immediate combat assignment in any objective evaluation system. The fact that she was considered inadequately prepared while inferior pilots were advanced reveals systematic problems that extend far beyond individual prejudice. The investigation expanded to examine pilot selection processes at installations throughout the Air Force, revealing patterns of discrimination that had prevented qualified women from advancing to combat roles across the entire military aviation community. The scope of the problem suggested that American air superiority had been compromised not by enemy action, but by institutional biases that had excluded some of the most capable pilots from serving in critical roles. Major Thompson, whose own career had been shaped by navigating institutional resistance to women in aviation, submitted detailed documentation of evaluation disparities that provided evidence for the most comprehensive reform of military pilot training in decades. The evaluation criteria that excluded Captain Mitchell from combat roles were applied inconsistently and reflected subjective biases rather than objective assessment of pilot capabilities. We systematically excluded exceptional pilots while advancing mediocre ones based on gender rather than merit. The psychological evaluation records were particularly damning, revealing that female pilots had been subjected to assessment criteria that were never applied to male candidates with inferior performance records. Sarah's psychological profile had been criticized for, quote, insufficient aggressive instincts, despite her superior performance in every simulated combat scenario, while male pilots with lower scores were praised for natural warrior temperament based on gender stereotypes rather than demonstrated capabilities. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a military psychologist who had studied pilot selection processes, testified about the fundamental flaws in evaluation methods that had shaped the program's approach to female candidates. The psychological characteristics associated with effective combat pilots, situational awareness, rapid decision-making, stress tolerance, and tactical innovation, were demonstrated consistently by Captain Mitchell, yet her evaluations focused on subjective assessments that had no relationship to actual combat performance. The hearing revealed that Sarah's case represented the tip of an iceberg that extended throughout military aviation. Dozens of qualified female pilots had been excluded from advanced training programs, while less qualified male pilots had been selected based on evaluation criteria that prioritized cultural conformity over combat effectiveness. But perhaps the most damaging testimony came from intelligence analysts who had been monitoring foreign military aviation developments. Enemy air forces had been advancing rapidly in pilot selection and training, implementing merit-based systems that identified and developed the best pilots regardless of gender or cultural background. While American forces had been excluding qualified pilots based on prejudice, potential adversaries had been gaining advantages by developing all available talent. The strategic implications were clear. American air superiority was being challenged not just by advancing enemy technology, but by institutional biases that prevented the United States from fielding its most capable pilots. Sarah Mitchell's mission had demonstrated what was possible when exceptional pilots were given opportunities to prove themselves, but it had also revealed how many such opportunities had been denied based on irrelevant cultural assumptions. General Harrison addressed the panel with recommendations that would reshape military aviation for generations. We need immediate implementation of objective, merit-based pilot selection criteria that evaluate capability without regard to gender. We need retraining of evaluation personnel to eliminate bias in assessment procedures. And we need a comprehensive review of current combat pilots to identify and correct past selection errors. The reforms would be extensive and expensive, requiring fundamental changes to training programs, evaluation procedures, and institutional culture throughout the Air Force. But the alternative was accepting that American air defense would continue to be compromised by biases that prevented the nation from fielding its most capable pilots when national security depended on exceptional performance. As the hearing concluded, it was clear that Sarah Mitchell's 47 minutes of combat had exposed institutional problems that extended far beyond individual discrimination. Her mission had proven that American air superiority required the best pilots available, regardless of gender, and that cultural prejudices were luxuries the nation couldn't afford when facing increasingly sophisticated threats. The woman who had been dismissed as unqualified for combat operations had not only defended American airspace, but had forced the military to confront fundamental questions about how it identified and developed the warriors who would protect the nation in an era when enemies were advancing rapidly and margin for error was disappearing. 2 years after her legendary dogfight over Nevada, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell stood before a new class of F-22 pilot candidates at what was now called the Mitchell Advanced Fighter Training Center at Edwards Air Force Base. The classroom that had once witnessed her own dismissal as unqualified now bore a plaque commemorating the most successful air-to-air engagement in modern American military history and the institutional transformation that had followed. The faces looking back at her represented the new reality of American fighter aviation, 40% female, selected through rigorous merit-based evaluation systems that assessed capability without regard to gender, background, or cultural assumptions. Among them sat Captain Lisa Rodriguez, whose academic scores and simulator performance rivaled Sarah's own record, and Lieutenant Jennifer Walsh, whose tactical innovation during training exercises had already earned recognition from senior Air Force leadership. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah began, her voice carrying the authority of someone whose combat experience had reshaped military aviation doctrine, "you are here because you represent the absolute best pilot talent available to the United States Air Force. Your selection was based on demonstrated capability, proven performance, and the kind of tactical thinking that our nation needs to maintain air superiority against increasingly sophisticated threats." The transformation had been comprehensive and sometimes painful. Colonel Reynolds had been relieved of command and forced into early retirement, his career ending with the kind of institutional disgrace reserved for officers whose personal prejudices had compromised national security. The pilot selection systems he had championed were completely restructured, replaced by evaluation criteria that prioritized objective performance data over subjective cultural assessments. Major Thompson, now promoted to colonel and serving as deputy commander of the training center, had overseen the implementation of new evaluation protocols that eliminated the gender-based discrimination that had characterized previous programs. Her research had become the foundation for Air Force-wide reforms that were being studied and adopted by allied nations whose own pilot selection systems had been compromised by similar institutional biases. "The F-22 you will learn to fly represents the pinnacle of American aerospace technology," Sarah continued, her presentation incorporating tactical lessons learned from her historic engagement. "But technology is only as effective as the pilot who integrates it into a coherent fighting system. Your mission is to become the kind of warriors who can defend American airspace against any threat, using every advantage available while understanding that ultimate success depends on superior decision-making under extreme pressure." The curriculum had been revolutionized based on analysis of Sarah's combat mission, incorporating tactical innovations that had emerged from her engagement against multiple sophisticated opponents. Her use of vertical maneuvering combined with beyond visual range missile employment had become standard doctrine, while her integration of electronic warfare tactics with close-range gunfighting was now considered essential knowledge for all fighter pilots. Captain Torres, who had recovered from his training injuries and completed the rebuilt program, now served as one of Sarah's senior instructors. His own experience with the old evaluation system had given him unique insight into the institutional changes that were reshaping military aviation culture throughout the Air Force. "The difference is remarkable," Torres explained to visiting Pentagon officials during one of their regular inspections of the reformed program. "We're identifying and developing pilot talent that would have been excluded under the previous system, while maintaining training standards that actually exceed what we achieved when selection was based on cultural assumptions rather than demonstrated capability." The statistical evidence was overwhelming. Pilot graduation rates had increased by 37%, while training accidents had decreased by 52%, indicating that merit-based selection was producing more capable pilots who were better prepared for the challenges of modern fighter aviation. Female pilots were achieving gunnery scores and tactical evaluation ratings that consistently exceeded previous program averages. But perhaps the most significant validation came from operational squadrons that were now receiving pilots trained under the reformed system. Squadron commanders reported improvements in tactical innovation, mission effectiveness, and unit cohesion that reflected the superior preparation and diverse perspectives that emerged when the best pilots were selected regardless of gender. General Harrison, now serving as Air Force Chief of Staff, had made the Mitchell program a model for military aviation training worldwide. Her speeches to international defense conferences consistently highlighted how institutional bias had weakened American air power, and how merit-based selection had restored the competitive advantages that technological superiority alone couldn't provide. Captain Mitchell's mission didn't just defend American airspace, General Harrison told a gathering of NATO air commanders. "It revealed that our greatest vulnerability wasn't enemy technology or tactics. It was our own prejudices preventing us from fielding our most capable pilots. The reforms we've implemented aren't just about fairness. They're about national security and maintaining the air superiority that modern warfare demands." The international implications had been profound. Allied nations had requested assistance in implementing similar reforms to their own pilot selection systems, recognizing that gender-based discrimination had compromised their air defense capabilities in ways that could prove catastrophic during actual conflicts. The Mitchell Doctrine was becoming standard practice among democratic air forces facing increasingly sophisticated threats. Dr. Elizabeth Mitchell, now serving as a senior advisor to the Pentagon on aviation technology and pilot integration, had published research demonstrating that diverse pilot populations achieved superior tactical results than homogeneous units selected through traditional methods. Her daughter's combat success had provided the data necessary to prove what aerospace engineers had long suspected, that human factors in advanced aircraft operation were more complex than cultural assumptions had recognized. Sarah's own career had accelerated rapidly following her historic mission. Promoted ahead of her peers and given command responsibilities that reflected her unique combination of combat experience and institutional reform leadership, she had become the public face of changes that were reshaping American military culture at the highest levels. The memorial wall in the training center lobby now included photos of all 5 enemy aircraft that Sarah had destroyed during her legendary engagement, alongside technical analysis of the tactical innovations that had made her victory possible. But more importantly, it featured images of the female pilots who had graduated from the reformed program and were now serving in operational squadrons around the world. Your success here will be measured not just by your individual achievements, but by your contribution to maintaining American air superiority in an era when our enemies are advancing rapidly and mistakes have strategic consequences. Sarah told her students during their final briefing before beginning advanced tactical training. Among those students was Captain Maria Santos, whose own journey from exclusion to acceptance reflected the broader changes that had transformed military aviation. Santos had been rejected from 3 previous training programs based on evaluation criteria that prioritized cultural conformity over demonstrated capability, but the reformed selection process had identified her as one of the most promising pilot candidates in Air Force history. "Ma'am," Santos said after the briefing, her voice carrying the gratitude of someone whose dreams had been rescued from institutional prejudice. "I wanted to thank you for proving that excellence transcends the limitations that some people try to impose based on gender. Your mission didn't just defend American airspace. It opened doors for pilots like me who would have been excluded under the old system." Sarah's response reflected the broader perspective that had emerged from her experience with institutional bias and eventual vindication. "Captain Santos, you earned your place here through superior performance and demonstrated capability. My mission simply forced the Air Force to acknowledge what should have been obvious from the beginning, that defending America requires the best pilots available, regardless of gender or cultural expectations." The evening formation flight that concluded each training week had become a symbol of the changes that Sarah's combat mission had triggered throughout American military aviation. F-22s, flown by pilots selected through merit-based evaluation systems, led by officers whose advancement reflected capability rather than cultural conformity, protecting airspace above a nation that had finally recognized that its security depended on excellence rather than tradition. As Sarah watched the formation disappear into the desert sunset, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from dismissed trainee to combat legend to institutional reformer. The path had been longer and more difficult than anything she had anticipated when she first dreamed of flying the world's most advanced fighter aircraft. But it had ultimately led to changes that would benefit generations of pilots who would never face the barriers that had nearly prevented her from serving her country. The sound of F-22 engines echoed across Edwards Air Force Base, their distinctive roar now representing something different than it had during Sarah's own training. These were aircraft flown by pilots chosen for their ability to defend American airspace rather than their conformity to cultural expectations, trained by instructors whose own experience had proven that excellence emerged from merit rather than privilege. Sarah Mitchell had started her journey hoping to prove herself worthy of flying America's most advanced fighter. She had ended it by proving that America's most advanced fighters were only as good as the pilots chosen to fly them, and that those pilots needed to be selected based on capability rather than the cultural assumptions that had nearly cost the nation one of its most effective defenders. The woman who had been told that certain doors weren't meant for everyone had not only opened those doors but had ensured they would remain open for every qualified pilot who followed, regardless of gender, background, or any other factor unrelated to the ability to defend American airspace when the nation's security depended on exceptional performance in the cockpit of an F-22 Raptor. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.